Hello friends, it's Sasha Trebesco again. Once again, I'm doing this as part of my friend Navid's YouTube channel. So what I'm going to do today is, since in the last video I focused on some super basic ideas for white, this video I'm going to focus on some very basic ideas for black, and in particular how to defend against this one opening that I see very frequently playing on Lichess. So in this particular case, this is actually from a game that I played just recently, and I played as black and my opponent was playing as white. So my opponent starts out with the strongest opening move, which is knight to f3, and essentially the response here is basically forced for the reasons that I mentioned in the previous video. So of course I responded pawn to f6. Now what he did afterwards, typically what players do is something like knight to d4. But instead what he did was he played e3. Now this is not something that I personally had found in my research on atomic chess openings. However, it's something that I'm seeing increasingly frequently on this website. So I felt like it's important to make sure you know how to tackle this particular opening as black. So the response for this would be d5. The reason for that is kind of complicated, but basically the idea behind moving this e3 pawn outward is giving all these different opportunities to both the queen and the bishop. And what this does is, similar to regular chess, takes control of the center and makes sure that these two squares are off limits to pieces that are trying to make a quick break into the position. In addition, it also frees up the queen a little bit, and more importantly, it actually frees up this bishop right here to go out here. What white played afterwards is knight to e5, and this seems a little counterintuitive at first, because the natural idea here is simply to take the knight, and that does lose the pawn, but you know, you got rid of the main threat. But of course this makes things severely complicated for black in this position, because both of these diagonals are open, and so the queen or the bishop can actually swing out and give check to the king, and that would cause some very serious problems for black. So instead of capturing, what we do is we actually allow white to put their knight on this f7 square by playing the move bishop to g4. And this is something that I alluded to previously when I mentioned that we would be opening up this bishop using that d5 move there. And what bishop to g4 does is it directly threatens checkmate by attacking this queen. Additionally, it prevents the queen from swinging out and causing tremendous losses on this king side here using this diagonal. In this particular game, white responded with with queen to f3, and this is perfectly manageable. But some other responses might have been, for example, knight takes. This would not have been a very good response because essentially white's threat is completely neutralized there at the expense of merely a bishop. And in this chess variant, a knight is definitely worth more than a bishop, and perhaps worth almost as much as a queen. So, and of course something else that white can do is swing this knight down here, and that is something that this particular player did later on in the game. So with black playing bishop to g4, white is forced to play queen to f3, or at least is forced to play, for example, pawn f3, as in this case, But the reason why this is not a very good move is that it doesn't actually do anything to deal with this threat, and it blocks in the queen. And in atomic chess, mobility is your #1 concern. So instead of playing pawn to f3, queen to f3 was played. And the response here is also kind of passive from black, but nonetheless very important. And this is pawn to e6. The logic behind this is pretty much getting pieces away from the king, because even pawns that can be taken right next to the king will of course lead to checkmate, lead to the king being blown up. So we're trying to get all these pieces away from the king. And of course the secondary function for this is just opening a square where the knight and bishop can go to in case of any sort of need there. And in fact the bishop can utilize this entire diagonal if needed. Next, white plays this move that we've been waiting for, which is knight to f7. This seems very, very bad at first for black, because black has two options, and that is either lose the game altogether or lose a knight and a rook in exchange for a knight. So what has to happen here is black must move the queen away to c8 to prevent instant checkmate. But if white does take the liberty of playing knight takes h8 and gaining that material there, black always has the move bishop takes queen, and at this point the advantage definitely goes to black in this case. That is why in this game white did not play that move. Instead, white went straight for the check, and that was bishop b5 check. This is a good move, but it's not very hard to deal with from black's standpoint, because we simply advance the c pawn to c6, and that of course has the dual role of moving all the pawns to the 6th rank and creating this sort of force field that prevents the pieces on the 8th rank from being taken. And obviously it pushes back the bishop and makes it unable for the bishop to do what it was intended to do. Now the next move is kind of interesting, played by this particular player. It's not a very good move, because I can at least sort of see the idea of trying to fork the king and queen, but obviously this must have been some kind of blunder from white, because what happens afterward is bishop takes, and we are left with no bishop, but also we are left with no knight. Now, so this is probably going to be as far as I'll go into this game. It did end in a draw after a series of very, very long combinations. But the point I'm trying to make with this one game here is just that how to deal with these threats that are constantly happening from white, and how to deal with this very interesting sort of e3 idea from white, which is very, very common. So just to review really quickly, when white does play e3, d5 is your preferred move. Now, the natural move for white is knight to e5, and that's a-okay because we can threaten the queen. The queen comes out, open up the bishop, and this seems good for white, but as it eventually turns out, white cannot take the rook because that would lead to the queen being taken, and sort of a loss of momentum for white in this example. And of course, in this game, white blundered, and then blundered again, and after a few moves, black had a fairly clear advantage. Of course, I would go on to blunder myself a few moves down the road, and in the end, we end up with a draw, But this player was higher rated than me, and we had played several good games before. He had won a few of them, so I was happy with the draw, and in the end, I just got a little boost to my rating. So hopefully now you understand how to defend against knight f3, e3. And in general, this formation that we end up with here successfully neutralizes the threat from white's king-knight. So it's very useful to know just as a general combination to play. Thanks for watching the second Atomic Chess video. As I said before, as I get better and better at this game and study more, I'll definitely share my discoveries with you. So hopefully you will continue with me on this journey and keep watching the next videos.